this computer. Okay, we are going to talk about PROD2, Data Integration Post-2017 Q Upgrade. As you know, Legacy Snapshot was finally fully removed from 2017 Q2 going forward, so we needed to come up with a method to still process the Legacy Snapshot files produced because the banner and other teams associated with that process were not able to modify them to be data in the new DI tool compatible. So the files they're sending are still 100% the same. When they're getting put on the SFTP is 100% the same. We have since put in a middle layer as a short to medium term workaround that will do some format changes and then pass it to you to be processed by the data integration tool. There's two components to this. We have kind of a pre-format step, which is done from a script that runs in the global background node. And this will kind of remove the, do a couple different items. And then there is actually a lot of work done during the actual data processing itself, where we did with custom scripting in the data integration tool. Give me a sec, let me find a file set here for you, and I will start sharing some very exciting SFTP action here. All right, so you basically, the idea is that the data is going to be produced and processed at the same time, so in the middle of that, we've got to make some changes. Let me pull up one of these schools. So there's 5 schools in PROD2 right now. This is not sharing. Why is my sharing? I want to share my whole screen. Resume share. Pause share. Stop share. Let's try share my entire screen. Why is it not sharing my entire screen? All right, you guys should be seeing my SFTP. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah.
And then when I switch to Firefox, now you're seeing Firefox?
Yeah.
Thank you. For some odd reason, when I tried to go to Firefox before, it did not cooperate. So yes, there, I believe, are 5 different schools that are in, that we're talking about PROD2. USA previously had already been set up if they, using data integration. So what the work we just put in around is to cover Kendall, Miami, NSAD, and CSF. So in this pre-format step, what they're doing is they're going to be, first right after that, when things need to be removed, is removing file footers, because the footers that you have in Legacy Snapshot are no longer needed or really used as part of the new data integration tool. So right off the bat, it's doing the pre-format, is going to go through in each of these files. You'll see when you look at them, it will remove the footers. Let me just show a quick file here. As you see, no exciting footer. So that's the first step that it does while it's modifying the files. Second thing it's also going to do is it's going to create a user association file. This is, we also wanted to get this so that the users are associated to the node, to the root level node in the institutional hierarchy. So you'll see this file I have highlighted here, the domain ID IH associate node user, and GBN stands for global background node, because that's where the file is being generated from. When you look in this file, it's very straightforward. External user key, the external node key, which is always going to be the root level, and then the external association key, which is for Blackboard, gave us for some odd reason the ability to actually specify the ID of the junction. And we're just using the user ID .primary because we're going to consider this the primary association, and the data source key is matching the file name. So fairly straightforward file. There is some type of bug around this process. So when you look in the data integration logs, which we'll look at a little later, you're going to see a decent amount of warnings on this. Still got to work. It's on my list to work on. Another thing that this process is doing is, if you notice, there's no catalog or category files. In the transition to the new setup, we just going with the institutional hierarchy, you no longer need those because we're not actually using them. There's really the only functionality around this that was used for a while was in doing the domain collections. And that was only for 2 of the schools, and we've switched that to using just data source keys. And then once we can get fully to institutional hierarchy, then there's really no need for the catalog or category files whatsoever. So part of this pre-format is it's actually deleting those files, because they're not needed, so it's just cleaning them up. The final step of what it's doing in this pre-format step is it's actually creating disabled Delta files. And so because a lot of the pre-formatting we're doing, post-formatting during processing, we needed to do those dynamic files, and you look at like courses and enrollments. We're doing the initial processing those in store mode, which means we don't have the ability to disable enrollments or courses that are not in those files. So what it's also doing is generating a disable file. And let me see if I can find one of those. Here's one in the data set. So you'll see it'll start with the domain ID, and it'll have the word disable, and then the rest is the same. And basically this is just so in the 2018-10 file, when this ran, it did a comparison with what's currently in Blackboard, and it said, oh, this enrollment does not exist anymore. And so it just created a disable file. Just course key, user key, and data source key. The minimum amount of information needed to process a enrollment disabled, to disable the enrollment. It'll do this process for course files and also for enrollment files. And what it's doing behind the scenes is it'll just be processed where the course files and enrollment files are all processed using store mode. The disable files are actually processed using the delete mode, which we currently have set not to purge, but just to disable. So that's how we can still maintain we can just, because the current snapshot files are an all or nothing, and in the legacy mode, we know in legacy snapshot mode, it would just disable anything not there. All right, so that's the pre-format step. That's going to happen, and these files will then be reformatted to what we just talked about 5 minutes before the processing time. So you see for NSAD, USN1, they're processed on schedule at 6 a.m. So at 5:55, these files will be picked up off the SFTP, reformatted to the steps we talked about, removing the footer, creating the user association file, dropping the catalog and category files, and then creating the disabling Delta files. And then it'll be put back up there a minute or so later so it can then be processed at that 6 a.m. time. That same process, does go on, is for all 4 of the schools. So let me see, get the time. So when you're looking at Miami, they're processing at 8 a.m. So this pre-format process goes at 7:55. Same thing for NSAD, which is at 6 a.m. at 5:55. CSF is at 4:25 because it processes at 4:30. And in Kendall, they have 3 different process times at 12 p.m., 5 p.m., and 9 p.m. So, 11:55 a.m., 4:55 p.m., and 8:55 p.m. is when this pre-format step runs. All right, so that's the first component of this. Is there any questions about what is happening before the processing?
Sort of. You mentioned that we're cutting out the catalog and the category files.
Yes.
One thing, maybe this is just different on PROD2, and we don't need to factor this in, but on PROD3, that's the main hook that self-enroll uses to dally out access to each user and tell which courses they are not supposed to be able to access. Do we have an offshoot process for that? No.
See, in PROD2, when you look at, and I'm not 100% sure if that's actually accurate in PROD3, but I'm not going to look it up right now, but PROD2, how it controls you look at the domain configuration of these schools, and I'll use USA Managed Collections. You're looking to it's all data source keys for there, and then the LHEG schools, which are the LHEG domains, which are the other ones that are used for self-enroll. These are all data source keys as well. So the categories are not used in PROD2. We did, and during a previous meeting where I was kind of going there, if we did find 1 or 2 of the schools that still had been set up at the school level to use this, but we've since changed that. So for PROD2, they're all using data source keys for domain collection population. And so there was no need for the catalog or category. PROD3, it may, I don't think it does, but I'd have to look at it, and we don't have time for it in the context of this meeting. Did that answer your question or concern?
Close enough. I think we have different perceptions on PROD3, but I don't think that's relevant right now.
Yep. All right. So the pre-formatting, like I said, it does. It's going to focus on these getting the files. Then there's a decent amount of formatting that needs to happen for them actually to, well, not a decent amount. There is formatting steps that need to happen for it to be processed by the data integration tool. And in the new data integration tools, there's an option called custom scripting, where we can do runtime changes using Java. That's super, super not exciting. In most cases, when we look at what it's doing, and I'm just doing it from here, the majority of things, all we're doing is adding a data source key. It's all we had to do to get it to work. Like, there's hard coding for USA or USK1 that all data comes with the USK1.user.text data source key. And you have the same thing when you look in courses, where we got to update the data source key. And courses a little differently just because it's got to be dynamic. You know, it's based upon the term code, is all it's doing. An additional step it's doing in courses that it's not doing elsewhere is it's got to create the association. So it's creating the ID for the primary, the junction ID, the association ID, which is just the course key plus primary, and it's associating all the courses to the root level USK1. This is just initially, this is short term. Once we can get the banner files updated, they may have a much more in-depth structure, institutional hierarchy-wise, but right now, everything's being associated to the root level. So users, courses, Kendall does have organizations, but it's the same. It's a hard-coded data source key because they're only sending the one, and it's only just for student enrollment, so we didn't need anything dynamic there. So you've got, and then the secondary institution role. So the majority of the formatting changes that are done during processing is to add a data source key. And that's why when you look back historically at these files, you'll see that there's not a data source key column added, because it's actually not added to the file beforehand, it's added during processing to the data itself. You know, we did this just so as a short-term stop, but also so it was pushing this step not so it's from a server level that it can be done from the application. So more people can get access to it and make the changes, make any changes or look at it if needed. That is basically the same for, let me get back up, for Kendall, CSF, and NSAD. Miami, being it's the special snowflake that it is, had some additional requirements. You know, we did that, we were doing that whole term start process for Miami where we needed to stage course files at certain times and make the enrollments at certain times.
Miami
so
to requirement to be a Halloween costume.
Yeah, Miami they do have lots of little things that they wanted in there. That was something kind of went over with Jesse. You know, what they had been set up for them, so we don't have to do that anymore. And the nice thing is we were able to get it in a way that it does not. Sorry, I'm looking at the spot where we can cover the requirements. And I'm just going to get to a archive set here. So when you look at the original files for Miami, there's some things you'll notice that are different. Their duration is set to continuous, where everyone else it's range. They don't have a start or end date. If you notice, those are blank. They're actually being sent though as part of the institution name column. Some of the other changes that we made for Miami that we were doing during the mitigation process was this start date they wanted to be moved 5 days forward, and this end date they wanted it moved back 365 days. So, and that these changes are actually being done during the data integration, you know, during the actual processing of the rows. So you're not going to see it in the data when you look at it, but when you look in the actual configuration for Miami, and let me get in there, you know, it's being done there. So we look at, and I'm going to talk, so we have the data source key, we had to do everywhere else. Then we're actually setting the duration to be date range or range, which is what that value would be in the legacy snapshot. And then we're actually setting the end date based upon what was set in the institution name. And then we're adding the 365 days. So this is done during the actual formatting. We do the same thing we talked about for setting the primary node association. So we have the junction key And then we have it setting everything to the USM1. And then we have the start date. We're doing the same idea. We're taking that first date out of the institution name, and then we're subtracting 5 days from it. There was a requirement for Miami about instructors getting access. One of the other things we did with playing with the enrollments was instructors getting access to courses 2 weeks before. And how we were going to handle that is up until 2 weeks before, see, courses are currently coming over as enabled yes, or say, excuse me, availability indicator equals yes. Now what we're doing in the data integration, if it's within 2 weeks before, it's going to be set, the availability will automatically be set to no. And that's done from here. You know, where it's just saying, get the start date minus the 2 weeks from the 5 days they wanted to move it back already. And so if it's doing the comparison there, so it's if it's within or after 2 weeks, set the availability to true, otherwise the availability will be a false. And that way, that is going to stop faculty from getting in the 2 weeks before. I make the students, their access controlled from the start date, but then this availability flag is being used for the faculty. I don't know if I have an actual, you know, Miami course that I can show where it's within 2 weeks. Let's see if we can find it real quick. That's 119, so we'd need something that is like October. Oops. So 2007, 10. Let's see if we can find that. Nope, there's none with an October start date. Let's try 11. 12? Of course not. Do I have anything 2018? Okay, so there's none in this data file where they have a start date that would be where it would show the course as being unenabled or unavailable, excuse me. Let's try one of the newer files so you can look at that. Here's a 1029 one. So this should be available at this point because it's within 2 weeks. So I'm just going to look and confirm that. And availability is yes, which is what we wanted to see. But I'm trying to find one where we have one from. Nope, unfortunately they don't have any. Oh, here's one. It's an end date, of course. I don't want an end date. I want a beginning date. Okay, well, they don't have any sections where I can currently show this behavior, but it's part of the process that's going on is that the availability will automatically be set to unavailable until 19 days before the start date is specified in the file that's actually sent from Miami. So these are all done, so we no longer have to do that change every semester to handle this. But I wanted to make sure you guys were aware of the changes put in place for Miami.
Suppose we need to follow up on one of these things in a ticket. Are we just checking the input versus the output, or is there a log somewhere of these internal changes?
I mean, and so everything is going to show up in the data integration logs. It's just, as you know, it's unfortunately not sometimes the easiest to find. You do have when it's now being processed by the SAS controller. So there's that third component where it's formatted, and then instead of using the legacy snapshot controller, we're using an SAS controller, the new one put up by ICM, which does the same thing. It grabs a file in SFP, sends it to the Blackboard to be processed. It does produce a slightly different controller file. You'll see this BBGS SIS task execution file. Same information. The format is a little different. You'll see it starts saying, okay, this is data integration. It talks about where it's running. It talks about where it's temporarily stored. It talks about some past archive files. Folders, let's see, where is it talking SAS? Should talk about the files it finds. It's talking about the files it's found on the SFTP. Here's the whole list of what it's going to process, and then it's going to go through one by one and start processing them. Let's see. So when you're looking here, the important thing, the main thing you're looking here is what mode it was done in. So you know, okay, this is the user file that was running complete fresh mode, is the actual file name. and then you can find the reference ID, which is where you'd want to look it up. If you need to look up the logging for this, you get that out of that file. Let me find my missing one. Vlog reference code. And it's going, and then here you go. It's going to give you. So it didn't produce anything else because there's no errors. But that's basically the short way of hunting down the data. The way I find the short way of hunting down the data integration, like how it processed. Let's see if we can find one that got an error. Q error count 0. Let's find the next fake error count. All right, so this one has 170. Which file was that? That was the, so the course file had a bunch of errors in it when we look at it. So let's change our reference code. And then you can start seeing, you'll see that it'll end with the process 85, and that there's 85 errors in that. So for some odd reason, all of these errored out. And let's see what we're looking at. Create course. They're gonna, for some odd reason, it's throwing up 2 error messages. So this one is basically gobbledygook. Doesn't really give you anything that's any of use. It's the next one that actually has some useful information. I don't know why they coded it that way. They just did. And this is saying create this course and saying the course copy key is not valid. And that's why it was not created, because the master is not in place. Did that answer your general question, Charles, about how you can see what the file is processing, look up an error?
I think so.
Okay. And I realize this is kind of forcing us to get used to and use as a whole the data integration tools for all files. So I think it's kind of a good thing in that regard. All right, so we talked about the pre-format and the post-format, which is the main information I wanted to convey, that these are the data changes and where they're being done. You know, we're going to get this a little more obviously documented out once we hand this off to Chris to look at and watch this exciting 30 minutes and then turn it into an article. So hopefully there'll be some documentation where you can look at this as well, where it just says this is what it does pre and this is what it does during. But I wanted to make sure I introduced it to you during this TKT.
Thanks.
You know,
Thanks.
you're going.
So we
Okay.
got to jump off. It's 10 o'clock.
Yep. All right. Well, I'm going to stop recording.